Hello everyone and happy Limerick Pride and welcome to this trans talk in conversation with myself, Noah Halpin, Sara Phillips and Turraoin, as well as Michael I can never say your name, Michael, I'm so sorry.
It's all right now.
From Limerick Pride. I hope you're all having a lovely Limerick Pride and you had a good weekend and that you managed to celebrate it in some special way despite the kind of strange things going on in the world at the moment. But we're delighted to have you here and hopefully we'll have a few laughs and we'll all learn a thing or two along the way. So firstly, I just want to introduce our panelists today, and we're very lucky to have Sara Phillips, who is a trans activist working globally. Sara's been involved with trans activism for 25 years. She's currently in her third 3-year term as chair of the board of directors of Ireland's national trans organisation, TENI, the Transgender Equality Network. She's the founder and researcher and archivist of the Irish Trans Archive. Sara was one of the lead negotiators to the Gender Recognition Act 2015 and served on the governmental review of the Act in 2018. Sara was honoured as Dublin LGBTQ+ Pride's Grand Marshal in 2018. Sara is also a board member of the National Women's Council of Ireland, the treasurer of both the International Trans Fund in New York and the Transgender Europe in Berlin. Sara is currently the national manager in Ireland for a multinational construction materials manufacturer, CPG Europe. And I really hope that I never have a CV that long. Next up, we have Turraoin. Turraoin is vice chair of TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, having served on the TENI board since 2016. Previously, they campaigned for gender recognition as well as marriage equality as an organiser with LGBT Noise, as well as being a founding member of the Irish Trans Support Alliance and coordinator of Trans Training 2012. They've also served on the board of the Sex Workers Alliance Ireland, which is SWAY, since 2016. Turraoin identifies as non-binary. Then we have with us, joining us today, is Michael, and Michael is the events coordinator for Limerick Pride. Michael will be joining the conversation today and be putting some questions to the panel that were submitted by supporters of Limerick Pride. Michael is also a mental health activist and is also otherwise known as the very fabulous and very talented Carried Away on stage, and can be a bit funny at times too. So I guess where we'll come to, I'm going to come to you first, Sara, just to give us a bit of background about gender recognition legislation in Ireland and the Gender Recognition Act. So I guess the easiest thing to ask first is basically, what is the Gender Recognition Act and what does it allow us to do and why is it so important for trans people in Ireland?
Yeah, Noah, thanks for asking me along tonight, and it's great to be here with you. I think just to kind of give people a little bit of an idea, gender recognition is about providing identification documents specifically, which provides trans people the gender identity that they are currently living in. So gender recognition is a mechanism in which you can change the gender that has been assigned on your birth certificate. Many countries around the world have had this mechanism for years, albeit that they've been very, I suppose, negative ways of doing it. They've been very restrictive. You had to be medicalized, you had to be diagnosed, you had to go through various different steps and provide evidence that you were also living in that gender for a long time. So, however, Ireland in 2015 enacted legislation that provided gender recognition based on self-determination. And what does self-determination mean? It basically means that nobody else has a say in designing your gender other than yourself. Now, there are some restrictions in that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But having been one of the last countries in Europe to able to have a law such as this, Ireland actually jumped to only the fourth country in the world that provided gender recognition by self-determination. And it's a very simple process. You download a form from the Department of Social Protection and fill it out, get your signature witnessed, send it away, you receive a gender recognition certificate, and that certificate provides you the option then of being able to ask for a new birth cert. And just to clarify, that birth cert is not replacing your original birth cert. That original birth cert is locked away, and this new birth cert provides you with a document from this day forward. We're coming up on, as I said, the anniversary of that legislation. It was passed in the Seanad for the final part on the 15th of July, so that's only coming up next week. And I know last year we all celebrated that, having been the 5th year. But also something that, and I'll just touch on this before I go into why it's important for us, it's also the fact that there are currently only 12 countries in the world that actually provide gender recognition based on self-determination. And self-determination, there are a number of states in the United States, but the federal government don't approve it. However, why is it important? It's important because it gives you the respect and the dignity for you choosing who you are. We all have a sense of our gender identity. Everybody has a gender identity. You don't have to be trans to have a gender identity. Everybody has. It's just the fact that that gender identity for most people is actually the same as was assigned at birth. But for trans people, it's not the same. We would have a different gender identity. And going back then into what I said a moment ago around the restrictions within the current legislation, this legislation currently only has a binary modality to it. In other words, you have to be able to move from either male to or female to the other gender. It does not allow people who are non-binary to access that legislation. And also it doesn't allow under 16s to access that legislation. And there's quite a lot of restrictions between 16 and 17. You have to have a diagnosis, you have to have 2 medical people approving it, you have to have your parents' consent, and you have to have a court judicial approval as well. By the time you've gone through all of that, you're 18 and you can go through the simple process.
It's interesting hearing kind of different countries in comparison. I actually didn't even know that we are one of 12 countries. I actually would have thought it was a little bit more than that. So, you know, that's a really interesting kind of comparison to make. And
yeah, it's interesting that there's only 5 in Europe. You know, a lot of the countries that are actually involved do provide self-determination are actually in South America. You know, in Europe, you have Denmark, Malta, Luxembourg, Norway, if you include them, and ourselves. And that's it. They're the only countries in Europe that provide self-determination. But the rest of the countries are in South America, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Uruguay, Ecuador. I think that's the 12. Like, you know, it's been an interesting conversation. Portugal have a process which some people call self-determination, but it's not quite where everybody else is. So you could make it 13, but there is still a certain amount of qualification in their approval system.
right. And I guess we can't really talk about gender recognition in Ireland without talking about how it came about and how we achieved or people achieved you know, self-ID gender recognition, and maybe you can take us back to where that fight started, because I think there's a very important lady that we can't not discuss when we're talking about gender recognition in Ireland.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have to, for everybody out there, if they don't know the name Dr. Lydia Foley in the LGBT community, they should be ashamed of themselves, basically. Dr. Lydia Foley is the hero of our community and a hero of the wider LGBT community as well. You know, and it's not just about gender recognition, because a lot of people don't understand all of the other things that she did as well. But back in having transitioned in the late 80s and having had gone through medical transition, she was looking for documentation that would recognize her gender. And in lots of ways, that would have been sufficient to be a passport or a driver's license or whatever. But she was informed at the time by her legal representation that the only way she could do that was get what is, to all of us, the fundamental identity document in Irish law, and that's the birth certificate, changed, and that would then open up access to a passport and a driver's license and all the other things. So she went through a process in looking for advice. She then got legal representation through the free legal aid advice centres, and they provided her with a barrister. She took a legal case against the Registrar General in 1997. And this process started back in 1993. There's a great letter that she has that I have in the Irish Trans Archive, which actually says, "Thank you for your letter. There is no mechanism in Irish law for us to make a change, but we will keep your letter on file." It always reminds me that Donegal Catch advertisement, "We'll keep your letter on file." And it was up to 2015, it was still on file. But in 1997, she took that legal case in order to try and get the government to make that change, to put into law some sort of mechanism. That case was eventually heard and was decided upon in 2002. Ironically and very sadly, that the government or the court found that there was no mechanism and advised the government that they should put in some mechanism for transgender people to be recognized within their gender. The day after she lost the case, the European Court of Human Rights found for an English woman, Mrs. Goodwin, and found that the UK government should put into law some mechanism to recognise her rights. And in doing so, it meant that they had put precedent in the European Court of Human Rights, which Ireland was a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, and therefore Lydia always knew that if she eventually went that far, she would win the case. They appealed the decision, but the appeal fell because, again, there was still no mechanism in place, so therefore it was not going to be anything. She needed to go from the High Court to the Supreme Court and then on to the European Court of Human Rights. She battled away. She realised that if she took a new case, she would have a better chance of winning it. That case was heard in 2005. It was only adjudicated on in 2007, and actually the final decision didn't come out until 2008, even though we talk about 2007, because that's the day the judge says that the government have got to put into place that our current legislation was incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. And if you think about it, we're talking about 1993 to 2007, and the government appealed the case. It's crazy. But eventually dropped the appeal in 2010, and then the new government coming in with Labour and Fine Gael in 2011 make decisions that they're going to enact some sort of gender recognition. By then, the trans community, specifically around TENI and a lot of other allies like LGBT Noise, as you mentioned, about Carul being involved there, got in behind it. Other civil society organizations like Amnesty also get in behind the push for gender recognition. And it took a long time. There was a lot of lobbying, a lot of talks, there was a lot of media, despite what people say these days. There's a lot of nonsense going around saying that there was not a lot of media. I wrote a piece for the Times, which was never published recently, that in the 2 years prior to gender recognition, there was 152 articles in the newspapers, 6 TV appearances, 32 radio appearances, 2 video launches, and 1 TV3 program which mentions gender recognition and self-determination in it across the whole of the program. So by then, all of that lobbying started to create momentum.
Then Lydia, can I just ask, didn't Lydia very much go through all of that very much by herself?
Yeah, well, up until about 2012, yes, 11, 12, around then, she was very much, she was supported by the free legal advice centres. There were a few individual trans people around her turning up to court cases, supporting her, but generally we were talking 2 or 3 people. We're not talking about a community. It was only when, I suppose, TENI became professional and they had the time and the resources to be able to put a lot of time into this, and also that funding that we had received also was part of the process about trying to get gender recognition in the same way as marriage equality was also part of that kind of professionalization of LGBT groups.
Because I'm sad to see, like, I know you've shown me some of the articles from back kind of in the early days of her fight. And I still get sad to think that she was treated so badly, you know, by a lot of newspapers, and horrible things are said, and she didn't have like this huge community behind her during that.
No, and I mean, it's like you're right. A lot of those articles, I keep them for the archive, and I share them in a lot of the conversations I talk about. You know, they're horrific. People are doorstepping her. They're watching where she's going. They're following around her, you know, her local town, taking photographs of her. There's some horrific articles written in the newspapers. It's, you know, she will never be, or sorry, he will never be a she, or, you know, headlines, these sort of things. All horrible kind of literally taking her whole life apart, chasing down her family, you know, which obviously was very private conversations between her and her family, chasing down, you know, what her job was. She lost her job. She lost her business. You know, all of these things were all done especially between 1992 and between 2007. And in lots of ways as well, in the very early days, and I've spoken to a number of people who were in the community at that point, thought she was nuts, you know, so they were never going to support her. So yeah, so it was very difficult, but very much she then, you know, by 2011-12, people did start to get in behind her, start to make, you know, we're very much friends, trying to make sure she was okay, you know, and move it forward. But remember, we have to keep going, in the sense that by 2014, Lydia went back to court again, because the decision that had been put in 2007 still hadn't been enacted. So she went back to court again and won again in the court. And then by 2015, she was, as I say, gender recognition came in, and delightedly and brilliantly, she got #1, you know, the very first ever gender recognition, appropriately, she got it. So yeah, but she's, you know, she's an amazing woman, and, you know, we've all met her, each one of us here. It was her birthday the other day, so if she gets a chance to watch this, happy birthday, Lydia. And she did an amazing video recently with Shout Out, which kind of gives a lot of that, how she felt through it all. You know,
I'd encourage anyone to go back and look through Shout Out's pages and find that video, because I watched it myself the other week, and, you know, it was, I've kind of never really heard her speaking so openly about her experience at the time. So I'd encourage anyone watching this to go back and look at that.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, as I said, you know, again, the Gender Recognition Act, as brilliant as it was, there's still a lot to be done with it. There's still a lot of work, you know.
That's what I was that was kind of my last question for you, was that you mentioned earlier about the fact that it is a very binary piece of legislation, you know, it isn't accessible to younger trans people. But what can we do to fix that? I know there was a review in 2018, 19?
17, 18, yeah.
So what can we do?
So the government, one of the things that we did win in the Gender Recognition Act originally, before they eventually agreed to self-determination, was a review of the Act in 2 years. Because at that point, we didn't think we were getting self-determination. And there was also a lot of issues. The government at the time were talking a lot about, you know, there's not enough evidence for young people. There's not enough evidence for under 18s. We need to review that. And, you know, it's moving so fast, there'll be more information. So they did bring in a review, which I think you mentioned in my own bio, that I was part of that review. I was on that committee. However, let's be very clear, there was 2 trans people on that committee, a couple of allies, but more or less it was mostly civil servants. And yet we brought out recommendations that very much were in line with what the community wanted. You know, it recommended non-binary recognition, it recommended under 16 recognition, and it also recommended 16 to 18 recognition with only parental consent. So anybody under 18 could have recognition with parental consent. And again, we must remember, we're talking about a legal document here. We're not talking about medicalization. We're not talking about hormone treatment, surgeries, all of that. We're talking about a legal document that provides you with identification papers that you can traverse life in a very simple way. So the first thing is that the current government have agreed to enact the changes for 16 and 17-year-olds in under 18s, and that they would review the effect of non-binary recognition on the rest of the governmental workings. In other words, the other departments, which they were supposed to have had completed last December, which obviously hasn't started yet because of COVID. And then lastly, then they were also supposed to bring in, they haven't done anything about under 16s. They're basically said they're not going to do that for the time being. I do know that the current Minister for Children had mentioned it, that we should consider it with this part of the legislation. So obviously when this comes back up on governmental listings for discussion, I think we need to start pushing for everything that the recognition committee, the recommendations that the committee brought in, that all of those recommendations should be brought in.
Right. So I think it is on this government's programme in an oddly worded way, I think. So once that does come up, it's all about, starting to create that push once again, both within the community and outside of the community, I'd imagine. Well, thank you so much for that, Sarah. I'm sure we have a couple of questions at the end for you. And I'm kind of so glad, because for anyone who has watched both Sarah and Carol speak before, even for me, I've seen them both speak an awful lot, and I learn something new every single time I listen to them talk. So I might go to you now, Carol. So you identify as non-binary and you use they, them pronouns. So I guess firstly, what I want to ask is, oftentimes we'll, speak to people and people will say, my pronouns are they, them. And a lot of people at first have a bit of difficulty with using they, them pronouns, or don't quite understand the use of they, them pronouns, when what people often forget is that they often use they, them pronouns every single day and don't realize that they do it. But could you tell us a little bit more about they, them pronouns and what you'd say to people who do or are having difficulty using it with maybe one of their friends or anything like, or family members?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Noah, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this event this evening. Just before I talk about non-binary pronouns, Sarah reminded me of a few things there when she was talking. I remember I must have been a small child at the time. I wasn't even a teenager at that stage. But I remember seeing Lydia Foley on 6-1 News talking about her court case and talking about identifying as transgender. Now, like I said, I must have been a child. I can't remember what year it was, but I must have been a child at the time. But that whole battle was still going on. Years later, I'd moved to Dublin. I was involved in LGBT Noise, and we organised the second of 2 rallies for recognition outside Leinster House. Like, that battle went on so long to get gender recognition, and like Sarah says, it was well publicised at the time. Like, it was on the 6-1 News. We held protests. It was all over the place. But anyway, yeah, like I for a lot of people, identifying as non-binary and using non-binary pronouns like they is very, very important, to feel that their identity is recognized, feel that the people around them recognize them and see them for who they actually are, that it's not some kind of, distorted version of themselves that other people are looking at, and people are calling someone he or calling them she when that's not how they identify. That doesn't feel like the people around them really see them and recognize them for the person they are and for how they identify. One of the metaphors I kind of use about it sometimes is, it's kind of like, when you see some news article out of the UK and it says, British actress Saoirse Ronan gets award for blah, blah, blah. And people in Ireland go ballistic when that happens. And, for a very good reason, because people's identities are important. It's, we talk about sometimes identity politics, like it's, like identities don't matter, as if they're not really essential to people's lives and people's well-being, but they are. And it does matter to people, that you get their pronouns right. And it can be difficult to do. We know that it can be, especially you've known someone a very long time in your life. They change, they tell you, not that they change their identity or change their pronouns, but they say, actually, these are the correct pronouns for me. These were always the correct pronouns for me. This is always the person who I was, but now I need people around me to recognize that fact. It can be difficult to make that switch when you're used to using a different set of pronouns for that person. But if I were to try and give some advice to people about how to get it right, probably the best piece of advice is just practice. If you make a mistake, it's okay, stay calm, correct yourself and move on. But in your own mind, just always try and remind yourself, this person is they, not just when you're talking to them, but when you're thinking about them, you remind yourself. And through practice, that will get easier. For the same reason that it's so difficult to switch, for me, for example, people were calling me he for 20 something years before I came out to everyone. So, by virtue of practice, they've gotten used to saying he. By virtue of practice, they'll get used to saying they. And, there's plenty of people in my life who still find it difficult. And there's plenty of other people who've been using they long enough that they've gotten used to it. And it is easy now. They isn't the only, you can see, I don't know if it's showing up on Zoom here in front of me now. I don't know if it'll be showing up on the recording when it's put up on Facebook or wherever it's going, but you can see next to my name here, I've got they, them, their as my pronouns after my name. There are other what are called sometimes neo-pronouns that people use as well. Z spelt either Z-E or X-E. I think there's different ones in different languages as well. I think there's hen in Swedish. I might be wrong about that. In Irish, there's ear, which is, you can say shead, which is the Irish equivalent of they. Ear would be kind of like the Irish equivalent of Z. So there are different sets of pronouns. Most non-binary people probably use they, or maybe a mixture of he and she and they. But I would just take it on a, kind of a case-by-case basis. Someone comes to you and says, look, these are the pronouns that I would prefer you use. It's like, getting someone's name right. I have an incredibly weird, awkward name, and people go, try very, very hard to get my name right. You were asking me about how to pronounce it correctly before we started here, because, people recognize that that's really important. Some people can be, kind of stubborn around using the correct pronouns for someone, or stubborn around using the correct name for someone, and will refuse to do so. But for this, you should, if people are going to, try and get my weird ass Irish name correct, they should put the same effort into getting people's pronouns right, because it does make you, it does kind of let someone know, okay, these people care about me, they care about my identity, they care about me, they care about my gender being recognized and me feeling safe. And if someone's being really ignorant and rude about someone's pronouns, that's just going to make you feel more anxious about that person in general. If they're not going to accept that part about me, what else might they do? Are they going to be mean to me, every day I see them or something? It is really important just to put people at ease and to make them feel comfortable. And you will make mistakes, and that's okay. If you correct yourself and try hard to get it right next time, that's fine. No one's going to take your head off.
I think that's a really important point there, Cruel, what you made about, practice and recognizing when you made a mistake and correcting yourself and moving on. And like, I don't claim to be any sort of angel. And I used to, I know for a fact that I used to make mistakes, especially with my friends who use they, them pronouns quite a lot. But then after living a year and a half with a housemate who used they, them pronouns, I'm 10 times better than I used to be. Now, I'm not saying I don't occasionally still make a mistake, but I think having that, that time with somebody whose pronouns were they and them really, really helped me to just not really think about it as much, because I think the more you think about it, the more you get worried and the more likely you are to make a mistake. Well, that's me anyway. But I think, yeah, that's a really good point about practice and respect is kind of number one. And then, you identify as non-binary. So would you like to explain a little bit more to us about, for anyone who might not really quite understand what non-binary identities are, or don't know anybody who is non-binary? Do you want to explain to us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, non-binary is an umbrella term. It covers a lot of different individual gender identities underneath that umbrella. In the same way, the trans umbrella includes different elements within it: trans men, trans women, and non-binary people. Non-binary includes a lot of things within that as well. So some people might just use the word non-binary to describe their gender identity and feel, I don't need to specify more than that. Other people, they have a non-binary identity that fits within that umbrella, but they would be, would have a specific description for it. So say, for example, they might describe themselves as a demi-girl or a demi-boy, meaning they might most of the time, or half the time, or a lot of the time, identify as a girl or as a boy, but their gender identity is fluid, and in different times or different situations they feel more like a girl, and other times they feel more gender neutral, or they feel more like a boy. there's, you know, neutra or androgynous or gender neutral in general. Just, you know, they kind of, if you imagine a spectrum of kind of male at one end and female at another, they might identify kind of somewhere bang in the middle of that and kind of neither male nor female. Other people, they might not want to define their gender identity in relation to male or female at all. They might feel like, well, it's something completely unrelated to those two particular gender identities. And, you know, I don't want to describe my gender identity in terms of two other gender identities. I want to describe it on its own terms, and it might be kind of different. And all of that will, you know, be very different and unique for each person. There isn't kind of like a simple explanation of all non-binary identities that I can give you, any more than I can simply explain male and female in one breath, taking the two of them and slamming them together, you know. So it really depends on the person. And if someone comes out to you as non-binary, you know, just ask polite, you know, non-invasive questions. You know, okay, tell me more, you know, describe that to me. What does that mean to you? And get, you know, it will be very unique and very different from for each person. So the best thing to do is just ask the person that you're talking about. Again, non-invasive questions, because oftentimes trans people and LGBT people in general, we tend to get asked very odd questions by people sometimes. But, you know, if you ask in a nice way, you know, I'm sure people will be happy to explain, because if they've come out to you, you know, they want you to know about that part of themselves. They care about you. They care about your place in their life, and they want you to understand and to know this very important piece of information about who they are, so that you can have, you know, an honest, real relationship with that person. I'm feeling there's a second part to your question that I'm after forgetting now. Have I?
No, you haven't. But no, I always love the way you put things when you're explaining non-binary identities, because it just makes it so much easier to understand. I remember, I think it was one of the first talks we did together. I think it was the GCN live, Instagram live last year, and I remember listening to you, and I learned so much about non-binary identities just from that conversation. The way you lay it out is just so easy. So I guess, like, like on the flip side, I would identify as a binary trans person, meaning that I identify within the male-female binary. So I would like solely identify as male, and, you know, nothing in between male or female or anything like that. So I would never have quite a great grasp on non-binary identities, but the way you put it is just so much easier to understand than any books or websites I've ever read. So thank you for that.
I think I remember actually there was what I meant to say earlier, because there was a metaphor I used when I had that conversation with you last year, because I know for a lot of people it can be very difficult to understand. You know, I'm used to hearing about men and women. I thought everyone was either male or female. What's this, you know, non-binary thing? Like, what does that mean? It seems very abstract. And, you know, the best way I could kind of describe it, or one of the metaphors I like to use sometimes is, you know, I think people talk about identity, and especially non-binary identities actually very often talk about them as very something flippant or superfluous, or kind of very, you know, millennial Gen Z kind of thing, and it's not real. But in Ireland, we're very used to the idea actually of identity mattering an awful lot, just not in terms of gender identity. You know, go up to Northern Ireland and ask people how much does identity matter to them, and it's incredibly important to people. You know, it does have a big, it has value. People value their identity, and it's as if, you know, you were only ever given the choice to identify as nationalist or unionist, Catholic or Protestant. I know I'm on very dicey ground here now with this metaphor, but sure, we'll press on. But it's as if those were the only two options, which, I mean, historically kind of were the only two options for a lot of time. But I know a lot of people in Northern Ireland who, you know, ask them what's their identity, where are they from? They're from Northern Ireland. They don't want to identify as unionist or nationalist. These feel like, for them at least, not for everyone, but for them, they feel like kind of negative, very heavy labels to put on yourself. And they identify as effectively kind of a non-binary gender identity that's either between Irish and British, or they want to identify in a way that has no relation to the two of those. The other way I like to explain is, it's as if you had to define your gender identity in relation to, you know, North and South pole, and you were somewhere, you had to be on somewhere spectrum from the North Pole to the South Pole. Well, how do I give you directions to the moon if the only points of direction I can give you are in relation to the North Pole and the South Pole? You know, I can't. But there's a whole 3D universe out there beyond planet Earth. And that's kind of the situation we're in with gender identity, where people are only ever taught about two things, and then they discover actually there's a whole universe of gender identities out there. It's a little bit more complicated than you were taught in leaving cert biology.
I'd love you to write like a little coffee table book with all of your analogies. Like, I'd buy it. I definitely will buy it.
Yeah, metaphors are cruel.
Yeah, exactly. We can all brainstorm on what we'll call the book after this.
Well, it took 10 minutes to work out what the name of this talk was.
We might need a little bit longer for the book.
So, Krill, I just have one more question for you, and it's kind of just in a general sense in terms of the trans community. What would you say are some of the biggest kind of inequalities or issues facing the trans and non-binary community as a whole at the moment?
Probably the biggest single one, I would say, would be healthcare, as you're well aware yourself, because obviously that has such a huge, profound, substantial impact on people's lives. And it is something that certainly can impact their life on a daily basis. After that, if I were to try and name something, probably gender recognition, which, you know, wouldn't be kind of a surprise. But I suppose the impacts of gender recognition, they're often, you may not experience the impacts of that every single day, but it can be something that, you know, impacts you in small ways every single day. If you're, you know, I used to find myself just thinking, okay, am I going to go to I have to do that piece of business in the bank or the post office today. Do I want to do that today? Am I going to be asked for ID? You know, how do I feel about that? Have I had time to shave this morning, or did I decide I was going to wear makeup today? Okay, I did. Maybe I'll go to the bank tomorrow, and I won't wear makeup because I don't want to have an awkward conversation with someone when they look at my ID and they start asking me questions. And, you know, I think probably all trans people have had that experience where you have to produce ID in some situation, and you suddenly feel, you know, either someone is eyeballing you and is making you feel uncomfortable, but even if they're not, you still have the fear that that's going to happen. Like the kind of, I don't know what the right term to use for this would be, but the only phrase that kind of comes close to it in my mind is, in economics, you talk about the opportunity cost of not a decision you didn't make or an option you didn't choose. And I think that happens an awful lot for trans people, including non-binary people, where, you know, you self-select out of activities, or you don't go places because you're afraid of things that might happen, things that might have a very slim chance of happening. Maybe there's very little chance that I'm going to be walking down the street and someone's going to start looking at my appearance and eyeballing me and making me feel uncomfortable. And God forbid, you know, something far worse than that happening. But maybe just the possibility of that happening is enough to make me afraid and anxious and try and avoid any situation, you know. And I start not taking opportunities in my life that I might have, or things I need to do, because I'm afraid of how people are going to react in a bank, in a post office, going into a nightclub when I have to produce ID, going on a flight, you know, going through airport security. But healthcare is probably the one that, you know, I would say has an even bigger impact on people's lives. Pretty much anyone, if you live in Ireland, you're aware of the damage that being on a waiting list for years and years can have. You're aware of the impact of not getting timely healthcare, while you're waiting months, years, sat there, you know, waiting for medical treatment that feels like it's never going to come. And the mental health impact of just that kind of feeling of hopelessness that can engender as well. Plus, you know, for non-binary people, there's the extra anxiety around, if I go in and I tell them I'm non-binary and I tell them these are my pronouns and I present in a certain way, how are they going to react to that? Are they going to be positive? Is it going to be awkward? Are there going to be extra barriers thrown up? So I would say probably the biggest impacts for people are often have your own thoughts throwing questions and fears and anxieties at you, and that can really wear someone down, can be an exhausting problem to deal with. So healthcare and gender recognition, I would say, are probably the two I would put at the top of the list. But certainly, like, there's other contenders, the education system and the impact that can have on a young person at a very vulnerable point in their life. You know, that impact can stay with them then for years afterwards. The particular incidences that happen to someone in school might not be at the most severe end of the spectrum, or they very well could be. But either way, they're going to happen to someone at a point in their life where it could have a profound impact for a very long time to come. So those are the ones I would put at the top of the list. And there's certainly, you know, I think a lot for the audience watching this. I think the good news is there's a lot we can do about that as a community. There's a lot of action we can take to help fix those problems.
I suppose, Drew, I want to know, like, personally as well, Noah, thanks for allowing me to join in today. Because for myself, as an ally and cisgendered male who presents as male and sometimes becomes a drag queen as well, so I will switch between my pronouns when I'm in drag just because that's the character I'll be presenting. But I suppose for both of you or for all of you would be probably, you know, what can we do to help, like, to not allow those effects that would have on your mental health, that would, you would create that self-stigmatizing within yourself before leaving the home, like you've been saying, like worried about how people might perceive you or anything like that. Is there anything that we can do, like as allies, to help kind of move forward and kind of educate those that might be afraid to ask the questions because they don't want to ask the questions? Because sometimes in Ireland, as we know, it's better to sweep things under the rug than talk about them. So is there anything that we can do to help open that conversation a little bit more?
Do you want me to? I can come in if you want. I think there's a key piece that I would add as well to what Carol was saying, because I agree 100% with everything Carol said.
Yeah.
I would add in the education piece, wider education of society as understanding of trans people, because actually that's a bigger problem. That's just as big a problem. And I think part of that also happens within the LGBT community, because a lot of our own community don't actually understand the trans community, and they assume that, you know, all of those great things. And as we've seen this week alone in conversation on the airwaves around the kind of reaction to, you know, gay people on the street, even sometimes, you know, I think it was somebody was on News Talk during the week about it. But yet on the other hand, trans people are still getting that all the time. We you know, that rising of the kind of tide with everybody, when one person goes up, we all go up. That hasn't happened. We're still struggling with a lot of those problems. We're still having, we're currently I suppose the focus of attack in a lot of the kind of negative rhetoric that's going on the far right, with so-called radical feminists, with members within our own LGBT community, and don't actually understand what it means to be trans. And I think it's about that education, and it's about those who are in the community, the LGBT community, about providing that support, speaking out, try to educate your friends and your allies and your colleagues, and making sure that you know, trans people are supported. Because, you know, I love a statement which I'd heard from this time last year, which you know, Ollie Bell, who's a board member of TENI and founder of Trans Pride in Dublin, actually said was that gender recognition wasn't the end of the struggle, it's only the beginning. Because actually that's where the problem is. That's our decriminalization moment from 1993. And if you can imagine where the LGBT community had to come from in 1993 to 2015 in marriage equality, then look at where we still have to go. And I think that to me is critical, that we're a small part of the community. You know, they talk LGBT community is 10% of the population. Well, the trans community, and I would even argue with this number, is either somewhere between 0.6 and 1% of the population. So as you can see, we're much smaller. I would still even argue that's probably 0.1 more than likely of those of us who are out, or those of us who are visible. And therefore, I think what happens is that we don't have the opportunity a lot of the time to speak up for ourselves, because it's these microaggressions day in, day out, where somebody in conversation in your group says something and it's just passed off. So I think that there's a key piece about those who are willing to stand up for the community, to speak up, support us, be vocal within your own groups, so that we can spread that kind of ripple effect out there. because and watch the kind of campaigns that we're running, because a lot of our support that we get around any campaign we're running, whether it's gender recognition, whether it's medical care, you know, it tends to be from outside the trans community or the LGBT community. A lot of it is from more civil society allied in. And like if you go back prior to Noah being in TENI when he was running This Is Me, and he had 3 protests, the people who were turning up were not, yes, I'm not saying that there weren't some members of the LGBT community there supporting it, but for the best part, it was either the trans community, their families, their allies, and some of the kind of wider civil society groups that were turning up. And that's disappointing because, you know, as somebody pointed out, I think it was Lilith in her Pride speech last week, you know, we turn up for marriage equality, we turn up for repeal the 8, we turn up for all of these other things. And I think we need to make sure that the trans community are not left alone in trying to take these steps forward. And right now, there's a huge campaign to push us back. It's not even a case that we're trying to get from here to there. People are trying to do that with us. So it's key that is, you know, is people are aware in our community what's happening, see what's going on in the media, especially, and see what's going on in the press and on TV and radio and stuff, and some of the negative voices that are out there against us, and support us.
That's actually another video I'd like to suggest anyone watches. If you just Google Lilith Kiva Freya Carroll Pride Speech 2021, it should pop up in one of the first or second hits. It's an unbelievable speech, and she really does touch on an awful lot of the things that the trans community in Ireland are currently facing, and how people can help, and why we should all join together. So if you do get a chance, anyone watching, I highly suggest that maybe sorry, Limerick Pride, I think we'll put some links in the description of under this chat. I guess you know, I don't have much to add to the answer to that question, but you know, what I would always say is education's number one. Look out for campaigns and join in campaigns that trans people are running, trans organizations or groups are running. You know, if trans people tell you there's something wrong, there's something wrong. It's not something to dispute. You know, if a person of color tells you that was racist, you don't argue that wasn't. You know, it's you know, so it's education, it's joining in with campaigns, and it's not standing for any anti-trans remarks or jokes. You know, I would always say, if it's safe to do so, to pull someone up on it if you hear them at work or in school, or you know, when you're out and about. You know, if it's safe to do it, I always say, you know, that's not, we don't take that here, you know.
Yeah,
and
or even within our own community as well.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, there's nothing stopping people from writing to TDs about, say, the healthcare situation, the gender recognition situation. There's nothing stopping people writing to the HSE or government itself. You know, and that's something that only takes a few minutes and can be effective. So just little things like that is what I'd add.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Sara and Noah have said there. Absolutely. Like, I was just thinking about, you know, after the marriage equality referendum, there was this kind of warm glow that sort of wrapped around the country for a couple of years really afterwards. And I think for a lot of LGBT people, it was a feeling of, my state, my government, my country, my community, my society, my neighbors have said officially they embrace me and accept me and value me for who I am. And it does feel like, I think in the last couple of years, that sliding backwards in a lot of ways. Like, we're seeing a rise of the far right in this country, especially since the start of the pandemic. There's an uglier kind of public discourse in relation to LGBT people, and not just in relation to LGBT people, but also in relation to ethnic minorities, people of color, a lot of different issues. It does feel like there's an attempt to drag the country backwards through time to a previous version of Ireland. But, you know, for the months leading up to the marriage equality referendum, one of the nicest things you could see, certainly walking around Dublin, and I'm sure that was my experience, because that's where I was living, but I'm sure in all over the country, when you saw people wearing the little Yes Equality pins going around, it gave people just a really positive feeling of, you know, I feel supported by the community that I'm living in. And I also feel like I have allies, I have people who are going to stick up for me. I have a visible evidence when I walk down the street that there is momentum, there is a wave of change here. And I think, you know, Sarah was talking about microaggressions a minute ago. I think we need sort of like, I don't know what to call them, micro counterattacks or something. Like, you know, that kind of feeling of just lots and lots of individuals standing up, speaking out, you know, saying that they don't agree and don't acquiesce to really negative, bigoted, homophobic, transphobic, racist things that they see happening around them. That creates momentum, and it creates a, you know, a momentum that deflates attempts to attack trans people or to attack the LGBT community. That it makes it evident that there isn't support for that, and that you know, that is not legitimate. Those people do not speak on behalf of Ireland. They don't speak on behalf of the community, of the public. That can be really important and really powerful, not just, you know, for the individual who sees that and feels safer and feels more supported by it, but momentum is everything in activism or in politics or in social change. And at the moment, it feels like there might be momentum on the side that wants to attack trans people, and not just attack trans people, but attack the whole LGBT community, and attack ethnic minorities, and attack women's rights, and attack, you know, a long, long list of other things. But people, you know, just, it could be something as simple as like your friend makes a comment and you say, hey, that's not okay, I don't agree with that. Or you see something online and you say the same thing, or, you know, whatever it is, just taking any opportunity that presents itself to stand up and speak out, as people did in 2015, as like an awful lot of not just people within the queer community, but straight people as well, and cisgender people. That is powerful. It might seem, when the individual act that you're performing by standing up and speaking out, you feel like it's just me, it's one person, it's not going to have an effect. But when lots and lots of people do it, it has a huge, huge, tremendous effect.
Yeah. I'm just aware of time, so we might, I think there's 2 more submitted questions, is there?
Yeah.
So we might just run through those 2 briefly.
The first one, Noah, is for yourself. Noah, you work a lot in trans healthcare specifically. Can you tell us what the current state of trans healthcare is in Ireland?
I love how I just said we'll run through this briefly and there's no brief answer to this. So state of trans healthcare in Ireland is not great. Surprise, surprise. Unfortunately, here in Ireland, we run off this kind of non-evidential based psychiatric type model of care, like with qualities that are from models, you know, designed back in the 1950s, you know, we're still using here. And unfortunately, that means that, you know, it creates quite a gatekeeping situation, whereby, you know, we only have one gender identity clinic in this whole country, meaning that every trans person has to be bottlenecked through this one clinic, which is, you know, and they won't accept outside referrals from any mental health professionals. It all has to be done in-house. So when you're talking about the number of trans people there are seeking healthcare, all being bottlenecked through the one psychiatric team, it's creating this waiting list that we believe is currently sitting at about 3 to 3.5 years, which is really quite outrageous when you're talking about treatment so simple as hormone replacement therapy, HRT, which GPs can give to cisgendered people within 15 minutes of them walking into a GP surgery. But if you're transgender, you need to be put through this really archaic model of care and a service that's not fit for purpose, and wait those years. And, you know, not always do people get seen, not always do people get seen the way they should do, and are delayed, and there's no support in place for these people whilst they're waiting on these lists. There's no support in place for these people whilst they're going through the system. And then, as well as that, what we also have is no surgery options for trans people in Ireland. So the majority of trans people, almost all trans people, will have to leave the country for surgery. And I often say, like, what does that remind us of? You know, it's another situation of Ireland pushing its healthcare abroad. I myself went to Poland for top surgery, and most of my friends would. And, you know, unfortunately, we can't get an exact statistic in order to try and advocate for surgery space here, because most trans people end up fundraising and going privately abroad, and there are no real statistics. There are very few people will go abroad through the treatment abroad scheme, because it involves waiting those years to even see the clinic in the first place. Then it involves another wait period for having to be on hormone treatment for a certain amount of time with that clinic. Then another wait period to have a second or third psychiatric evaluation to go and have surgery. So it's all based on the system of having to prove yourself as opposed to being believed, which is completely wrong. So, you know, what we need to do is start to adopt WPATH, the World Association for Transgender Health's guidelines, their international best practice standards of care. And that's based off an informed consent model. And that's where we need to be heading. But at the moment, there's a lot of resistance from health professionals here in Ireland to do that. So, you know, we're not in a good place in Ireland. We're not where we should be, and we're not where we could be when it comes to gender affirming healthcare. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's key to understand as well that, you know, that whole current system, while they claim it not to be of a diagnostic model, it is very much of a diagnostic model. And similarly, the current World Health Organization's kind of understanding of trans identities and medical care is very much a general sex incongruence definition, rather than a gender dysphoria or gender disorder as it was previously, where in reality, while the language is not used, a lot of the system itself is working on that basis. And I've said before on various talks, you know, when I went through the system, you know, many years ago, it actually was based around the system that the WHO and WPATH recommend right now. You know, which is kind of weird that we've actually gone backwards compared to other countries around the world. And I think it's really incumbent upon the HSC to step in here and fix it, because it's not just for adults. You know, we've also got, you know, adolescents currently don't have a system at all. There was a system in place. It was a bought-in system from the UK. That system has now fallen. It's no longer there. And by the time they had left, the HSE were supposed to have brought in a healthcare system for adolescents and teenagers, which they haven't done yet. And while they'll say, and government will say, yes, the funding has been approved, and yes, we're going to do this, yes, we're whatever, they're still saying that 2 years later, since the recommendations of the Trans Healthcare Committee, which both Noah and myself were on, had been originally published, albeit that they didn't, you know, in February 2019, but then actually didn't come out, February 2020, and then didn't eventually come out until last December, only because there was a huge push to try and find out where the hell they were. So there's still a lot of work to be done. It's really disappointing that, you know, we are in a situation where there's restrictive, disrespectful healthcare currently in Ireland, and yet the world around us is moving towards a more respectful informed consent model.
Yeah, just to add to that, it is a very awkward and I think embarrassing situation for this country to be in, where in 2015, 16, 17, we were one of the world leaders in LGBT rights globally. And we kind of, if we had kept pushing at that point, we could still be leading the world in that. And it would be nice for Ireland, a small country, to be leading the world in something. But we've kind of slipped down the rankings now. You know, a lot of countries have brought in better gender recognition legislation, better healthcare for trans people since then. And we've since been overtaken by an awful lot of other countries. So, you know, let's hopefully we can get back to that point. But it'll be a real shame to kind of stand still and be overtaken and to just stick with the current system we have, when we could do an awful lot better and could be our world leader in LGBT rights again.
Can I just add something to that? Because, I mean, obviously we are still pushing and have been since 2015. We haven't let it go. We are still pushing and pushing and pushing, but it's a lot harder because 2015 and all its brilliance and all the wonderful things that were achieved in 2015, you know, it also brought a certain amount of complacency, you know, both in the political sphere, but also in the wider LGBT sphere. And therefore, it's like we've got it all now, and therefore, you know, we've got gender recognition, we've got marriage equality. And in reality, we're then, and this comes back to what you said, Michael, earlier, but how do you support us? Actually, the problem is we've been left then for the past 4 or 5 years trying to fight this advancements on our own, you know, so it really needs more of a push and more of campaigning, because we've really been doing that ourselves.
Yeah, agreed.
Really
so we
agree.
have,
I do think that we do as a community need to come together like we did before and actually show that we all support one another under this umbrella. It's not just about the first 3 letters. There are more. Like, we have to show that support to each other, because as you've said, and as Lilith said in the speech as well, you were all there to help with every other cause. So why now are you being left stood on your own, fighting this on your own? And me myself, as I don't feel like a great ally I hear in some of it, but that's something that the truth hurts, and we have to start understanding that, because yes, although we're all backing forward about wanting our own things, we are leaving certain people behind in the dust and forgetting when we get one good thing, it's like, no, hang on, there's more to come. You can't just run off. Keep up, let everyone keep up together. And I know myself, I'm going to be a better ally. And thank you to the 3 of you, especially. And I really hope everybody watching at home as well has learned a lot today as well, because I feel like I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everyone watching this. And, you know, hopefully you've learned something, and we're all going to come together and do a lot of good work in the future.
I know we have 5 minutes. Do we have one more question there, Michael?
Sarah, you also run the Irish Trans Archive. How far back have you been able to trace trans histories connected to Ireland?
Oh, well, how far back can you think? Basically, first of all, it's well known for a lot of people that, you know, back when in the kind of early 70s and early 80s, when the gay community was kind of forming as a community, and there was a lot of activism, the trans community were also forming as a community. And there is a lot of history there. But actually, trans people individually, actually, I've gone back currently into the 1100s. Let's be very clear here. Now, it's very difficult to use language like trans people, because that's language of today. So I tend to use words like gender variant. We cannot put labels that we use right now on people of the past, because they would not have known them. You know, transsexual or transvestite were coined the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So how can you put that on somebody who was in the early 19th century? It's very difficult. So gender variant, I would argue gender variant is more probably appropriate. But if you look at something like, say, the 19th century in Ireland, like, there's an actual rich history of gender variant people in Ireland, not only in Ireland, but also throughout the world. So you find names, you know, like Albert Cashier, Dr. James Barry, Edward de Lacy Evans, John McCormack, or John Murphy, John Bradley, Eliza Wallstein, you know, Marianne Weldon. Like, I've about 28 or 29 stories that I can talk about. I do this regularly. In fact, if anybody wants to look at it, I did a 2-hour talk for Ballina Arts Festival last week. It's up on their website. They just put it up today. And it kind of gives you a background of all of that. But also just something that actually went through my head earlier when you were talking, Carol was talking about non-binary stuff earlier, about that the idea of non-binary hasn't just come in the last couple of years. I mean, Ireland actually was a focal point in the early 20th century for people fighting the breaking of the binary identities, not having gender identities based on male or female. And actually one of the key people involved in that, it was a woman by the name of Eva Gore-Booth, who was also the sister of Countess Markovich. And actually, if you read, they produced a journal between 1916 and 1941. And if you look at that journal, a lot of the conversations around how the binary affects society, how people should be allowed to traverse back and forward between binaries, not to have a gender identity at all, have a mixed gender identity. If you feel like that you're male, you should be male. If you feel like you're female, you should be female. And like for, what is it, nearly 25 years, they were arguing this case around the world, but specifically in the UK and Ireland. And this was coming from an Irish, well-known Irish poet, a well-known Irish person. And when you read a lot of that magazine was called Urania, actually you then see that actually this idea of, say, somebody being non-binary is not something that's just come out of the woodwork in the last 10 or 15 years, as trans people have not come out of the woodwork in the last 10 or 15 years. So yeah, there's lots of rich history out there. There's lots of great stories. If you look at, say, Michael Dillon in the mid-1940s, the first man to have ever had bottom surgery, was studying in Trinity at the time, was working in Kappa Hospital, and basically was of kind of Irish descent, albeit born in London, but came home here because they had a house here in Lismullen up in County Meath. So there's huge, rich history there. And if anybody's interested, just give me a shout at irishtransarchive@gmail.com.
Well, we might also put the link to the video for Ballina Arts Festival down in the description here as well. We have run out. I could sit here talking to all of you for another few hours, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But one thing I do want to say for anybody who's not aware, there is a new trans peer support group for Limerick and its surrounds, run by Will. It was developed by Will and Lilith of TENI. I can't remember off the top of my head what day it's on, but the schedule is up on TENI social media, and it will tell you each week when whatever support group in whatever part of the country is happening. But there is a new one down in Limerick and for the surrounds of Limerick. And yeah, actually, maybe we can put that information. I'm sure we'll put all the information under the video.
Put all the information, all the relevant pages for everyone, so they can find out what they need to find out and find out what they can do to help as well.
Excellent. Well, all that's left is to say a very thank you to our guests, Sara or Phillips, Cruel Turraoin. Did I get it right? Almost.
You did.
Michael Verich. Can't say it. Go on, tell me, go on.
Verecki.
Verecki, sorry.
Well, you were heading there because you can say Verecki as well.
Okay, well then, I was nearly there. Well, thank you all for taking... Thanks for taking the time to join me, everybody, and for everybody celebrating Limerick Pride. Have fun, stay safe, and I hope, like I said earlier on, you find some special way to celebrate with friends, and yeah, just have a great time. Happy Pride, everybody. I'm Noah Halpin.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.